Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. As Meredith mentioned, I'm Karen Simpson, and I am the coordinator for the Southeast New England program, which is hosting the webinar today. I'd just like to take a couple of minutes to introduce you to the program, and then I'll turn it over to our panel of experts. The Southeast New England program, or SNEP, is a regional bi-state EPA geographic program aimed to restore coastal watersheds throughout Rhode Island and southeastern Massachusetts. The program encourages an ecosystem-based approach to increase effectiveness of long-term regional restoration efforts and envisions a resilient ecosystem of clean water, healthy diverse habitats, and sustainable communities in Southeast New England's coastal watersheds. Our main objective as a program is to build resilient ecosystems and connect communities through action, collaboration, and innovation. So we have 5 program goals. The first one is working towards watershed resilience to restore water quality and physical processes that support ecosystem function and watershed resilience. Also, to bolster sustainable communities by protecting and enhancing ecosystem services that support local communities in the SNEP region. Our third goal is to assess, track, and communicate change in condition and the effectiveness of our actions. Fourth goal is to enable innovative solutions that facilitate new technologies and approaches to improve habitat, aquatic life, and water quality. And our fifth goal is to leverage existing efforts by building on existing geographic programs and foster new programs in order to advance solutions to regional environmental issues. In order for us to address these program goals, the program has the ability to test out new technologies and approaches that would potentially lead to improved habitat, aquatic life, and water quality. EPA and the SNEP program are specifically interested in learning more about aquaculture practices, and through the SNEP program has funded pilot projects to test the ability of using oysters or ridge mussels as a means for reducing nitrogen in coastal embayments. The panel speakers that we have today will share their own experiences with aquaculture practices and how these practices could help support water quality, coastal habitat, and sustainable shellfish farming. Great, so we would like to just get a sense for how familiar everyone on the webinar is with aquaculture. So if you all could just use this poll to answer the question, what is your familiarity with aquaculture from 0 to 10? 0 meaning that this is the first time you've ever heard of it, and then a 10 is you're an expert and you do this for a living. So there are 4 choices, and we'll just leave this open for about 30 seconds. Okay, so the results are in. It looks like we have a good mix of familiarity with aquacultures, and this will be good for us to know, and I think for the rest of the webinar for our speakers to keep in mind as we're going through the rest of our presentations. So thank you all for answering the poll. Do we still have time for a question for Josh, or should we move to the next speaker?
Yeah, let's take a question. So we have a question that came in. Why are there no results on the nitrogen removal yet? How long have these demo projects been going on?
So it varies by project, but they've been going on for, I would say, 3 to 5 years, or 2 to 5 years. And some of it is the data is slow to be released. And the other parts of it is the data just isn't conclusive yet. Maybe there's an up and down, which doesn't really show you anything. So there's a degree of environmental variability that needs to be overcome, I think, to demonstrate effectiveness, especially when you're looking at 10 to 20% of a nitrogen load within a water body. You can imagine a little bit of environmental variability can cover that up or cloud that pretty quickly.
And then one other question, are there any examples from elsewhere in the country that have already measured actual water quality improvements?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, there's stuff in the Chesapeake Bay, but I don't know anybody's got the case study that shows, yeah, this is really effective.
Thank you, Josh. So we'll go to our next speaker now.
So I guess I will introduce our first speaker, Joshua Reitsma. Joshua is a marine program specialist at Barnstable County's Cape Cod Cooperative Extension and Woods Hole Sea Grant. He has worked with restoration and aquaculture of finfish and shellfish from Maine to Alaska and has managed a small farm in Virginia along the way.
All right, yes, thank you, Karen. Hopefully everyone can hear me all right, but as mentioned, I'm an extension agent based on Cape Cod through Cooperative Extension and Sea Grant, and I work in the area of fisheries and aquaculture. And over the last number of years, we've been involved in sort of an advisory capacity with projects that are looking at shellfish specifically for the purpose of nitrogen mitigation and our challenges here on Cape Cod. And this slide is intentionally very gray because it still is a pretty gray area here. Still pretty foggy about how shellfish are going to work for this purpose. So just a quick background, Cape Cod does have some serious water quality issues, mainly in the nearshore coastal environment due to excess nitrogen, which is deteriorating the water quality, and certainly habitat is being degraded. And this is a human-derived problem. The population has exploded here, fourfold increase since about 1960, and almost all of the nutrients or the nitrogen entering the coastal waters is from septic and wastewater type systems. So very much a human-derived problem. And in 2015, we had an update of the 208 plan, prompted in large part by a lawsuit from the Conservation Law Foundation challenging basically the lack of effort here on Cape Cod to improve water quality conditions. So what this 208 plan did is outline a number of potential approaches, both traditional and non-traditional, to meet water quality needs and sort of mitigate the nitrogen. And shellfish aquaculture is one of those potential methods for consideration. So this is the rough cycle of how bivalves interact with the marine nitrogen cycle. I'm not going to get too much into details here, but the important pieces are these green ovals over towards the right side and the bottom of the figure, and these are the areas of potential removal associated with shellfish. So the upper one is the harvest of the actual bivalves from the environment. That's why we have the rake there to sort of signify they would have to be harvested to be removed, to remove the nitrogen that's within the animal from the environment. And then in a more complicated system, the biodeposits associated with bivalves can either be buried within the sediment or processed by the microbial community and potentially released as nitrogen gas through denitrification. It's a pretty complicated process to sort of verify what's going on in terms of denitrification. It's also very expensive. So most of the efforts to date have focused on the harvest of shellfish and the fairly easily quantifiable levels within the tissues. So when talking about shellfish and nitrogen, we usually find it's important to reiterate to folks that shellfish are not sponges of nitrogen. They don't just soak it up. It's a lifetime of work to get a harvestable amount within those shellfish. So, you know, the basic process is the nitrogen feeds the algae then feed the shellfish, and the shellfish grow and incorporate nutrients into their tissues over the course of their lifetime of growth. So they're not, you know, immediately sucking it up from the environment. They're incorporating it as they grow into their tissues. So one of the first ways we got involved with this was we did a study looking at the potential sources of variability in terms of what's in a harvestable shellfish. So we looked at both oysters and quahogs, the two big species in our nearshore environment. We looked at a number of different water bodies. You can see that signified in the map at the lower right there. And we looked at some other different aspects, such as season of harvest, the different culture conditions. And in general, there was a little bit of a range. It wasn't one specific value that we found, but there was a range. And that was in the range of 0.2 to 0.3 grams of nitrogen per harvested animal at the current legal market size for a little neck size quahog or a 3-inch oyster. And then because of the lab that analyzed the actual tissues, there was some isotopic analysis. We had the signatures, and the signatures, especially in the near shore coastal embayments, did show signatures that would link them to human sources of nitrogen, meaning that the nutrients at one point in time, many years ago, went through a human wastewater system and then made it into the marine environment, and then ultimately into those shellfish tissues. So yeah, one thing to keep in mind when looking at shellfish, they have two very different pieces of their bodies, I would say. So there's the shell, very much mostly calcium carbonate. And then there's the tissue or the meat, which is very much where most of the nitrogen is. You can see the pie charts at the bottom, 2/3 to 3/4 of the nitrogen in a quahog or an oyster is in the tissue, and most of the nitrogen is in the proteins of the body. So you can imagine the tissue is going to have a lot more protein than the shell will. And just to put it in context, it takes roughly 4,000 oysters or quahogs to reach a kilogram of nitrogen. And if you were to try to remove that every day, you're talking about 4,000 animals to be harvested a day, which comes out to like 1.5 million a year or so. And so it's no trivial effort. It takes a lot of shellfish to have an effect on the nitrogen load to the environment. So how is this being used? Some of the initial thoughts were, why don't, we have this growing shellfish aquaculture community. Why don't we just try to credit them for what they're doing already? And challenges come in there in that shellfish aren't being grown in some of the areas that need the most cleanup. In some of the areas they're being grown, there isn't a need for cleanup. They're more offshore waters. And then there were challenges in who pays and what the value is. And there were concerns if a town is going to pay growers in one town for a cleanup and not growers elsewhere, creating a subsidy for some, so to speak, and not for others, that would create an unfair advantage in the marketplace. And I could see it potentially being challenged with the lawsuit. So there's certainly some challenges. And part of the problem with the Cape is we have so many small water bodies that we're looking to clean up, as opposed to one large bay, like the Narragansett Bay system or Chesapeake Bay system. So kind of some unique challenges to our geography. So most of the efforts to date are focusing on municipal control. So if the towns are going to be the ones who want most of the credit for the cleanup, they should probably be the ones in control of the project. So that is the focus of most of the current pilot projects. And unique to Cape Cod, we have municipal propagation programs or programs already in place where shellfish are being grown for resource enhancement projects. So I'm just going to quickly go over a few of these pilot projects. Mashpee, for one, was one of the first to have shellfish harvest being included in their comprehensive wastewater and nitrogen management plan. They did have to have a plan B, so if shellfish are not working for the said purpose over a period of time, they do have to go back to a more traditional approach. They are using both oysters and quahogs. About 10% of the nitrogen load is what they're targeting in the Mashpee River system. And it's not a whole lot of the load, but it is anecdotally significant in that they haven't had a fish kill since they're growing oysters in the river. So they do feel that they're providing a service. Quahogs are involved with other water bodies and trying to do sort of large scale resource enhancement, but having challenges getting at those values of 10 million quahogs per year. And in general, they're still waiting on comprehensive water quality analysis to see whether this is being effective, but they are literally doing shellfish by the truckload. So Falmouth, there's a project in Little Pond, which is a small coastal estuary, and they're targeting, again, 10 to 20% of the load. Again, you can see in the picture here, pretty industrial scale sort of surface farming of oysters. It's not cheap, $250,000 a year, mostly for staff to grow the shellfish, and they are growing them for a season in this water body, and then they have to relay them out for harvest in other areas because harvest is not allowed within this particular water body. Results to date that I've seen are some clearing of particulate nitrogen or the algae in the water. The water is getting a little bit clearer around the shellfish array, but very much still in question what's happening within the larger water body and whether it's reaching that 10% or 20% target that they're going for. But the social aspects, it's been, they've created a pretty large oyster fishery in the town and had a pretty good relationship with the neighbors. Despite when they flip their bags, there can be some foul odors involved, but they've sort of gotten through that. Another small coastal pond off Pleasant Bay, Lonnie's Pond. The initial intent was to target 100% of the load, but they're finding it more realistic to go for 25%. Again, sort of this industrial type floating array of oyster bags you can see pictured there on the lower right. Certainly very visible, not so popular with everyone, but it is a pretty expensive program, and it is part of their watershed permit, which is a unique permit for the 4 towns bordering the Pleasant Bay system. And again, the only results to date are some modest clearing of the water near the shellfish array, but no definitive data on the water body at large. But they are in the process of trying to privatize this through a contract with a private grower, because the town feels like they can't manage it effectively. So the universal challenges so far, still very much waiting for conclusive data or that success story. As you could see from the 3 projects I mentioned, there are others in the water. There's really no conclusive results showing that this is an effective way to go to meet nitrogen mitigation needs. There's definitely complaints from these programs about staff oversight within the towns to handle this. They're always complaining about being shorthanded. There's still a lot of questions about how private aquaculture will fit into the picture. Most of these are focusing on the municipal control again. It is not cheap. It does require fiscal resources. Some of the initial thoughts with shellfish aquaculture as an approach here were that it's going to be so much cheaper, but it is a yearly investment to get this done, certainly to meet needs of nitrogen mitigation. And in general, Mashpee's been going for the longest period of time, and they're finding it hard to scale up to those levels. 10 million cohogs is nothing to laugh at. So yeah, it takes a long time to get to those levels, and they've had challenges getting there. So there are very many challenges to growing shellfish. When we teach our fundamentals of shellfish farming course, we tell folks it's not for the risk adverse, because there are many things that could wipe you out, or just pick away at your profits. They're predators, crabs, drills, whelk, you name it. We have growing issues with poaching, not only of legal size shellfish, but last week we had a town had a bunch of seed stolen from their program. So there's people going at multiple angles, it seems, these days. So enforcement there is a challenge. There are many different sort of mortality events, namely disease. These are shellfish pathogens that affect the shellfish, not humans that would eat them, but they do tend to cause sort of pandemic type conditions. And a culture environment, the picture in the upper right was one of those pandemic type events with cohogs. There's worries that diseases could sort of evolve or new diseases emerge. There's some viruses that affected shellfish in Europe and Australia that are of concern. And then of course there's risk for storm loss, as well as up here on Cape Cod we have significant ice at times that can wipe out gear and animals. And there's harmful algal blooms which seem to be on the rise, which can affect both the shellfish or their ability to be harvested. So some of the other challenges that have been seen are the social acceptability of the space. These estuaries, especially on Cape Cod this time of year, are very popular for just recreation, swimming, kayaking, fishing, whatever it is. So there is a lot of concern when an industrial type grow out of shellfish is proposed for a water body, as you can see in the bottom right there. It's significant, it's visible, it takes away that area of water for certain activities, so it likely will get challenged if it's a well-used water body. Harmful algal blooms, like I mentioned, are on the rise. We've had some closures due to those, which affect the potential marketing, and if they're supposed to be harvested for credit, that is a challenge. And you know, market in general has become a concern with some of these pilot programs and how that's going to affect the current shellfish aquaculture industry long term. So just sort of looking at market dynamics here, the top left figure is production within Massachusetts. You could see in the last 15 years it's grown dramatically, and 95% of that is oyster production, all of which goes to the half shell market. So it's all production for one market. And then if you look up and down the coast, it's growing everywhere. So I grabbed Rhode Island, Virginia, and New Brunswick here, but you could look at almost any state or Atlantic province for that matter, from Texas to the Atlantic Maritimes, and it's on the rise. So there's more and more oysters on the market. Aquaculture is a big thing, and it's growing. So there is concern about reaching a saturation point, and you know, are we there? Depending on who you talk to, and what do we do about that? Especially if, you know, we're talking about millions of oysters in production for water quality purposes in some cases. How do we manage that? So on top of that, there's some volatility within oyster value. So this figure on the lower left is some older data, but it shows that volatility. So the blue line is the farmed oyster value here in Massachusetts, while the red line is the wild oyster value. And you can see the wild oyster value bumps around quite a bit more. And this becomes important when we look at these municipal programs of resource enhancement, which would then be harvested by wild harvesters, because they don't really have anything invested in production, as opposed to a farmer who does, and they need to, you know, sell for a set price to make ends meet. They can't sell for a negative yield, as opposed to a wild harvester, which has much less invested. They go out and harvest what they have, and unfortunately they are subject to whatever the buyer or wholesaler will pay them, which is why you see a lot of that volatility and supply and demand sort of dynamics. So when you have these programs looking at growing millions upon millions of shellfish for this purpose, and then going to market during a certain time of year because they just want them out, because they want the credit for the nitrogen, it does some things to the oyster market. And we've seen that sort of anecdotally here with these small pilot programs. And that is certainly a concern within the oyster farming community. And, you know, I think we need to think about that long term if this is going to be a viable method for nitrogen mitigation. Next slide, please. So one of the areas we're sort of looking at mentioning this market challenges, you know, everything up here anyway is going to this half shell market, the raw bar market. We no longer have any infrastructure for shucking oysters, though I think, you know, for these water quality purposes, it might be needed if we're going to do large scale propagation of shellfish for water quality. Maybe diverting those shellfish into a secondary market here, or a specific market to handle that and not affect the growing commercial aquaculture industry, which is growing on its own without you know, any sort of subsidy for water quality, is something that we're looking at and trying to bring back and sort of have it both ways, so to speak. So some final thoughts. Again, we're still operating in a gray area. We're still not, you know, completely sure how effective shellfish are going to be at reaching nitrogen targets, but we have at least a few solid projects in the water, and more being discussed. And nobody is really looking at shellfish as the sole solution. At times it's been talked about as a silver bullet to solve our problems, but in reality, when you get these pilot projects in the water, no one's really looking at it as the sole solution to the nitrogen problem. The conversation's moving much more towards this is something we can do now or relatively quickly, as opposed to building a wastewater treatment plant, putting pipes in the ground. But I think you do need to look at can it really replace source control, and is it worth diverting those resources and investment and time away from other technologies which we know will work long term to get at the solutions we need. And you just really need to be realistic and think the plan through. It's a risky operation, growing shellfish. There's lots of things that can happen over the course of getting them to that point where you're going to harvest, and it does require a lot of resources to get it done. So you need to have a plan for that, and that needs to include shellfish harvest and what the end disposition is going to be. So sort of looking at that market and where you are, and do you have a way to get the number of shellfish that you need to harvest out and not collapse the market to the point where you're putting other people out of business, or the value goes so low that they aren't being harvested. And finally, yeah, just acknowledging all the folks who helped me out and sort of provided this knowledge base that I'm sharing with you here today. And with that, I'll take a question or two if that's the way we're going this round.
Yes, great. Thank you, Josh, for that great presentation. Slides back up.
Okay, great. So our next speaker is Dr. Lindsay Green-Gavrielidis. Lindsay is an assistant professor at Salve Regina University in Newport, Rhode Island. She's working to help growers determine suitable sites for co-culturing kelp, oysters, and shellfish across the state. Take it away, Lindsay.
Thank you so much, Karen, and thank you everybody for tuning in today. So as Karen mentioned, my name is Lindsay Green-Gavrielidis, and my expertise is really in seaweed communities. I'm both an ecologist and also an aquaculture scientist. So I'm going to share today some of the work that we've been doing in New England on seaweed aquaculture, some of my research specifically in Rhode Island, and also just give a brief overview on the status of seaweed aquaculture here in New England. Okay, so we all probably are very familiar with the need for sustainable aquaculture. This is due both to a rising global population that needs sustainable proteins, and also in many places a rise in the per capita consumption of seafoods. So the latest data that's available for the US shows that the average American eats about 16 pounds of seafood per person per year. And because of that, we have a very large seafood trade deficit. And by that, what I mean is this is the difference between the seafood that we export as a country versus the seafood that we import as a country. And so the difference is a deficit of basically $14 billion in 2016. And so there's been a huge push for sustainable aquaculture to meet this rising demand for protein from our oceans, but also minimize the environmental impacts. And so seaweeds are a part of this, and that is because they do not require any what we would call outside inputs. You don't need to fertilize them, you don't need to give them anything on a farm in the ocean. They actually can take the nutrients out of the water column and produce a protein-rich, sustainable product. And so to that end, this is a very simple schematic, but just to give you an idea of the sorts of compounds that we're interested in seaweeds taking out of the water, mostly to improve water quality, they take up carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and phosphorus as a part of photosynthesis and release oxygen. So carbon dioxide, of course, is a concern due to rising levels in our atmosphere and ocean acidification. And nitrogen is a concern from nutrient pollution, as Josh mentioned in detail. And phosphorus is more of a pollutant in freshwaters, but can also be in excess in our coastal waterways as well. So if you grow seaweeds in coastal environments, and it's about 2/3 of the coastal environments in the US that are classified as having too much nitrogen, then there's a potential for us to be able to remove some carbon dioxide in addition to nitrogen, phosphorus, and produce oxygen, which is good for the other critters, such as shellfish, fish, etc., that live in those localized environments. And so this is a very, very brief overview of the seaweed aquaculture industry here in New England. But seaweed farming in the US really started in Maine. In 2009, the first commercial kelp farm in the country was formed. It went by the name Ocean Approved. It now goes by Atlantic Sea Farms. In 2018, which is the latest data, they produced, through farming, over 53,000 pounds of seaweeds, valued at about $500,000. And there are about 25 farms in the state of Maine. And so some of them are, most of them I would say are pretty small scale. I believe the largest one is about 25 acres, and that is springtide seaweed. So moving south in New Hampshire and Massachusetts, there has been some, what I would say, they're in more of an experimental phase. So there's been some experiments mostly tied with universities, both near shore and also some offshore experiments, and a few scientific research farms that are growing seaweeds. Rhode Island, which is where I am, we have, I put approximately 9 because we've had a real rise in the amount of people applying for permits to grow kelp. So this is approximately 9 farms that have been permitted to grow kelp. That doesn't mean they're necessarily growing kelp every season. But these are mostly oyster farmers, and they're really interested in diversifying what they're producing on their farms. And lastly, Connecticut, they have 8 farms permitted as well, and they have several in the pipeline seeking permits to grow kelp. So within New England, there are a variety of species being produced, but overwhelmingly the production is with sugar kelp. Saccharina latissima is the scientific name. And so when I came to Rhode Island about 5 years ago, I was approached by members of our oyster farming industry who were really interested in trying out kelp aquaculture. And they were seeking out expertise in terms of setting up farms and helping them determine where they could be successful with this. And that sort of led to this very large collaborative project that I've been involved with for a number of years now, where our ultimate goal is to develop what we call a spatially explicit model. And that's a really fancy way of saying a map that will determine which sites are best for culturing shellfish and kelp together. And so what we do to be able to model and form this map is we basically have established a variety of farms across the state where we're growing kelp and oysters together. And so we call those integrated multi-trophic aquaculture systems, or IMTAs. And we rigorously have monitored the production of both the oysters and kelps on these farms. All of that data goes to inform this model. And at the end of the day, we hope this model is going to give us a map where we can code regions throughout Narragansett Bay as, ideal for co-culture of these 2 species, maybe not ideal, or a place that somebody shouldn't try it. And that's because right now, what happens is somebody gets interested in growing kelp on their oyster farm, and they have to invest a lot of time and money into determining whether they can even grow kelp on their farm by doing pilot scale projects. But we would rather them have data that helps them determine whether that's going to be a profitable endeavor or not. And so these are the basic methods that we followed over the past 3 years. I'm happy to go into more detail about this, but these are really publicly available methods at this point in time. So I'm going to sort of skim over the details. But we of course established a kelp nursery at the University of Rhode Island. We plant the kelp in November or December, depending on the water temperatures each year. And we deployed a variety of sensors that measured water quality, light, temperature, etc. So throughout the winter months, we are visiting farms to monitor the kelp growth and look at how much carbon and nitrogen the kelp are removing from the water column. We also did this for oysters, but oysters grow year-round, so we did year-round data sets for oysters. And then usually at the end of April, early May, the kelp is all harvested, and we are able to determine at harvest the production, which we look at as in kilograms per meter of longline. And so this is a basic schematic of how these kelp oyster systems are designed. So of course, it's going to depend on the growing method for the oyster and the conditions on each farm. But generally speaking, here in Rhode Island, we have a lot of bottom culture of oysters in cages. And so what we're doing is we're suspending kelp long lines over the oyster cages or directly adjacent to the oyster cages on these farms, so as not to be in the way, so that the farmers can still access their oysters. And we suspended about 1 meter below the surface. Some farms are 2 meters below. It kind of depends on permitting. When you get a permit to grow kelp, they generally have restrictions in terms of how deep you must have it for boat traffic reasons, etc. And so this is a short video. This is a video that I took basically. I had the kelp line on the boat, so I had lifted it up out of the water to take some measurements. And so what you're seeing here is that long line basically dropping down to the level where we have it about 1 meter below the surface on this farm. And you can see the lush kelp that's grown. This is sort of middle spring. I think I took it in March. And kelp grows very, very rapidly in the spring months. And so it's this beautiful golden crop. And so I mentioned before that we're trying to form this model. And so in order to do that, what we had to do was set up multiple farms across the state that have different conditions. And so these are our 6 farms, and they were based on both water depth and also the nutrient levels. And so I have 2 of them circled here. So Rome Point, which is circled, is sort of in the middle of the slide there. That is about 20 to 30 feet deep and has low nutrient levels. And so the nutrient levels we thought might not be ideal for Rome Point, but traditionally kelp is farmed in deep water. So kelp can grow, depending on the species, maybe 3 to 5 meters in the Northeast in a growing season. And for that reason, people don't usually farm it in really shallow water. So you can imagine if you're growing a very, very long kelp, you don't want it to be scraping against the bottom. If it's scraping against the bottom of the ocean floor, it also gives opportunities for herbivores to crawl up onto the lines and eat your crop. But the sites that we have down in the southern part of Rhode Island, Point Judith Pond in particular, they are very shallow. So these sites are less than 3 meters. And remember, we're suspending the kelp line 1 meter below the surface, so you're losing that area as well. But we had a question about whether we could actually grow kelp there. It's not a place where people normally grow kelp. Kelp doesn't grow naturally in these areas. But the reason why we wanted to try to grow it there is because the vast majority of oyster farmers grow their crops in shallow waters. And they're coming to us as a community interested in growing this crop. So we had to sort of answer this question. And so I'm going to highlight the results of both Rome Point and Point Judith so that you can see how the depth of the water plays a role. Also remember that Point Judith has a bit more nutrients than Rome Point does. So this is the kelp growth data. And so these graphs show you the average length of the kelp blades. So up in the upper left, you have Rome Point. So this is our deep site with low nutrients. There are 2 different lines that we planted. So we're testing optimal planting date. So one was planted early November and then again about 5 weeks later. In the lower right-hand corner, you see Point Judith. So this site is only 6 to 10 feet, and that's pretty generous. It's probably more shallow than that at low tide. And we again planted 2 lines. These ones are only separated by about 3.5 weeks. But what you can see is that both of these sites, we have pretty similar growth rates in kelp. So the kelp did reach a bit longer of a length at Rome Point. So it averaged right around 1.5 meters after the growing season. Of course, the line that was planted first grew longer. So that just tells us we need to get them in the water as soon as possible. And one other thing I would like to point out. So in addition to answering that question, can we grow kelp in this shallow water? Yes, of course we can. We also saw, if you look at the bottom graph, that very last data point is actually lower. So you see a trajectory where the blade length is increasing the entire season, and then all of a sudden it drops. And so that might lead you to believe that the kelp was actually shorter during that time period. But this is actually an artifact of the fact that the length of kelp on a line is highly variable. So if I took two samples from 2 feet apart on the very same line that were seeded on the same day in the same lab with the same kelp, they could be vastly different sizes. And that's actually the variability there is being represented by that last data point. And so just to give a little bit, there are many more results that have come out of this project, but I'm trying to just give a brief overview, and I'm happy to answer any questions people have. But the main findings we found so far are plant kelp as early as possible, and it's all about water temperature. So we generally have to wait for the water temperature to drop below 60 degrees Fahrenheit in the fall before we can plant the kelp. We have found that shallow sites can be highly productive. So kelp is a potential aquaculture crop for coastal salt ponds and other shallow oyster or other shellfish aquaculture sites. And the kelp growth is highly variable within site. And so this is problematic for farmers for a number of reasons. One, it makes it more difficult for them to forecast how much they're actually going to produce based on how much long line they planted. And two, our consumer market in the US is driven on consistency. And so buyers and consumers want to have a consistent crop. So this is something we're trying to figure out if it's a microenvironment problem, if it's a genetic problem. Not really a problem, but what's driving this variation in length, and how can we get a more consistent crop? And then I just wanted to mention a couple of other barriers. So there's a lot of enthusiasm behind seaweed aquaculture. I am very enthusiastic about seaweed aquaculture, but I think we have quite a lot of challenges before we really get a sustainable, permanent seaweed aquaculture industry domestically. So besides, we know how to grow the seaweed now, besides sort of working out some of the kinks and consistency, there are barriers sort of to the post growing phase. So what I'm talking about here is harvesting. So these can be really heavy. They take a lot of labor during the harvesting process, and also they have a relatively low shelf life in terms of needing to be either packaged or refrigerated, etc. So that can be really challenging. So processing fresh seaweeds, also this market is in the way that it's set up is that most farms within the region are harvesting all of their kelp within the same 3 or 4 week period. So you have no kelp coming out of the water, and then all of a sudden everybody's harvesting their kelp. So there's a huge influx in seaweed for a very short period of time. And then also from the marketing side, so marketing products, coming up with products that would be acceptable for the United States market, that would also be profitable for folks to be able to grow. And so with all science, it takes a village. So I just want to take a minute and acknowledge all of my collaborators, all of my industry partners, and all of the undergraduate researchers that have participated in these efforts. And the funding was provided by the NOAA Saltonstall Kennedy Grant Program. I'm happy to take any questions now or later. And thanks so much for tuning in.
Great, thanks, Lindsay. So we had a question just clarifying that you said that seaweed is high in protein, is that right?
It will vary depending on the seaweed. For example, the species that we eat in sushi, which goes by the common name nori or laver, that can be up to 75% of its weight is in protein. Kelp is going to have a lower protein content, but compared to nori, so it's really it depends on the type of seaweed.
Great. And then another attendee had a question, if you could share a bit about how you first got connected with the growers to try to answer their questions.
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So I originally, when I came to URI, I wasn't working on aquaculture related things, but my PhD research was on aquaculture at the University of New Hampshire. And so I think my name came up because there's a publicly available manual about culturing seaweeds. And so I initially got connected through the through the Shellfish Cooperative actually in Rhode Island. And so most of the people that I've been farming kelp with are within the Ocean State Shellfish Cooperative. And so now I've just been much more involved in going to industry meetings, et cetera, to make sure that I have connections with folks.
Great, thank you. So we have a few more questions for Lindsay, but we'll hold those until the longer Q&A portion at the end. So Karen, on to you for the next speaker.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Lindsay. Our next speaker is Jessy Wayles. Jessy works at the Marine Discovery Center in New Smyrna Beach, Florida. She manages a program called Shuck and Share, which is a program that collects oyster shells from restaurants and recycles them back into the environment to restore oyster reefs and habitats.
My name is Jessy Wayles, and I'm the Conservation Science Coordinator at Marine Discovery Center. We're a 501c3 nonprofit in New Smyrna Beach that focuses on hands-on, feet-wet, environmental educational programs to get kids and grown-ups alike out into nature. So we've heard a lot of great things about mitigating the effects of nitrogen and phosphorus using shellfish and seaweed, but what can we do about all of those leftover oyster and clam shells after we harvest them? So today I'm going to be speaking to you about Shuck and Share, which is our community-based oyster recycling program. So I started at MDC in 2014, right as Shuck and Share was getting started. So I've had the ability to grow in my career while guiding the Shuck and Share program, which I think has been very instrumental to the approach that I've been taking with the program. We know that baby oysters like to attach onto something hard when they're larvae, so oyster shells provide an excellent base for them in restoration techniques. Shuck and Share was started in Volusia County after multiple shoreline and oyster restoration professionals came together to discuss the need for a stable source of shell for a number of upcoming projects. Before that, they were using a lot of fossilized shell, which could get very expensive. So Marine Discovery Center wrote the grant to house the Shuck and Share program. And after receiving funding from the Indian River Lagoon National Estuary Program, Shuck and Share was able to start recycling shell in the early year of 2014. So some of our program overview, you guys can follow along with the arrows. Our volunteers, program partners, or staff pick up oyster shells discarded by restaurants or from festivals or private events. For us at MDC, volunteers pick up the shell from 14 restaurants once or twice a week, depending on the season, and a local private waste management company called Waste Pro picks up shell from 2 of our larger grossing restaurants once a week. We're very fortunate that our Waste Pro division supports our organization and actually donates their time and trucks to collect shell for us, and we're able to use that sponsorship as in-kind match for grants. From there, the shells are brought back to our shell quarantine site at MDC, where volunteers turn them into restoration materials such as oyster bags, oyster mats, or oyster galleons, depending on our partner project needs. However, we do not bag up fresh shell. Since the majority of our oysters are not local to our waters, a lot of them are coming from Louisiana, Texas, or little boutique oysters from the Northeast, where y'all are. We could have bacteria or other pathogens such as dermo or MSX on them. We give them 6 months of quarantine time before bagging events so that the bugs can pick them clean, the rain washes away anything on them, and the sun bakes them dry. It's the way that we're making sure that we're putting safe shell back into our environment. Then the materials sit on our property until they're needed for a specific project by one of our many partners. Our oyster materials can sit on our property anywhere from 6 months to 13 months before they're deployed. And once they're ready to be deployed, volunteers will help to transport the materials to the site and deploy them on the site to assist with restoration. And when we're finished, the oysters have their final resting spot, protecting our coast or creating new habitat, as seen in the above right picture, instead of ending up in our landfills. And there are 2 keys to having a strong and successful oyster recycling program. It's our volunteers and our partnerships. Volunteers are the reason why our oyster recycling program is so successful. They really are the heart and soul of the program. They do all the stinky and unglamorous work, such as picking up the shells from restaurants, taking trash out of the shells, spending hours and hours bagging, having to listen to my endless stories on long car rides, transporting shells, and they're just the best. Like, this program would not happen without them. And at MDC, we're very lucky to have a core group of volunteers that come back day after day to help us achieve our goals. They take pride in the work that they're doing at MDC, and I've asked them why they keep coming back for those early sweaty mornings, and they told me because they feel like they're a part of the bigger picture, that we're all on the same team working towards the common good, and every time they come out, they learn something new. It may also help that after events, we go out for a round of beers, but I like to think it's the work that keeps coming them back. But none of this would be possible without our partners, because they're the ones that actually use our shell materials and utilize our volunteer help. So the pictures on this slide are some of the great field photos we've gotten with all of our partners out deploying different restoration sites. Partnerships with state and federal government organizations and fellow NGOs and universities allow for bigger and better projects. By partnering, we have the ability to share materials, share volunteers, and ideas to create a cohesive shoreline restoration plan. Partnerships with local businesses allow us to have a stronger influence in the community, and they help us to find like-minded citizens who are proud of the volunteer work they do. And at this point now, restaurants are calling me to recycle their shell. I don't have to chase them down anymore. So it's been really cool to see that shift where the restaurant owners are proud to explain that they are recycling their oyster shell for shoreline restoration. Kitchen managers are making sure that their staff is recycling, and everybody just wants this program to succeed. So as Shuck and Share got off the ground, other organizations started taking notice and wanted to participate. And we decided instead of reinventing the wheel, many of them have been happy to come under our umbrella of Shuck and Share while maintaining their individual practices and protocols. So we're able to share the same marketing strategy and the same logo, but everyone is kind of running it their own way. So as I said, we started in Volusia County in 2014. Since then, we've partnered with Brevard Zoo in Brevard County to the south. We then started a chapter north of us in Flagler County with the Friends of Gamble Rogers. We picked up a partnership with University of Central Florida and one of their friends' oyster companies called Bob's Nautical Nonsense. From there, we expanded to the west coast of Florida with the Halls River Alliance, and we just recently partnered with a new nonprofit in the southern part of the state called Coastal Connections. So each county does it a little bit differently, but we're all very successful. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the different numbers of shell that we've recycled since starting this program. So in Volusia County, since 2014, we've recycled 525,000 pounds of shell, and that has the potential to restore 6,000 meters. And most of that is coming from restaurants, festivals, and private events. In Brevard County, they've recycled 3.5 million pounds of shell since 2015, and that has the potential to restore 39,000 meters of shoreline. Most of the shell is coming from restaurants and festivals, but the majority of it is coming from a shuck house that brings in oysters from Apalachicola. In Flagler County, they have recycled 74,000 pounds of shell and have the potential to restore 825 meters. Oyster Bob's Nautical Nonsense, like I said, is a local oyster catering company that donates their shell to UCF. They've recycled 2,500 pounds of shell, which has the potential to restore 20 meters of shoreline. All of that shell comes from private events where they are catering. Mostly it's weddings and reunions. So Halls River Alliance started recycling their shell over on the west coast of Florida. They just recently started, and I think they have about 5 restaurants on board. What's really interesting about what they're doing is we have a very large scallop season here in Florida, and it's only during the summer months. And what people do is when they gather their scallops, they actually shuck them and throw the scallop shells back into the water. And it's creating some issues where there used to be deep water, it's now shallow, there's too many shucked shells. So they are hoping to capture the majority of those shucked scallop shells and use them in conjunction with oysters to stabilize shoreline. So they don't have any projects on board yet, but we are hoping that they're going to be able to grab a permit for it. And lastly, a new nonprofit popped up down in the southern part of Florida in Indian River County called Coastal Connections. They just received grant funding to begin recycling oyster shells from restaurants in 2019 and just signed contracts in June. So they're focusing right now on getting the materials that they need to recycle the shells and then finding restaurants to get on board. So all of that together is 4.1 million pounds of oyster shells that we've kept out of the landfill, which is the weight of the space shuttle, external tank, solid rocket boosters, and all the fuel combined at launch, which living near the space coast of Florida and being able to watch shuttle launches regularly, it's a pretty cool way to visualize all the shell that we've saved. So where is all of that shell? The recycled shell has been used for multiple restoration projects along the state at 16 different sites so far. Some are shoreline restoration projects to create living shorelines, which utilizes oyster bags and oyster shell, along with plants such as spartina and mangroves to create a stable shoreline, while others were purely oyster reef restoration, which just strictly creates oyster habitat. To date, our partners have restored an estimated 4,000 meters of shoreline and 1.75 acres of oyster habitat using recycled shell. So to kind of get the word out there, in 2016, we created a website. I wish I had put the website title up here, but it's shuckandshare.org. It's a way to kind of give an overview of the program and also get people involved. So the idea is that if you go to a Shuck and Share website or Shuck and Share restaurant on the East Coast and want to learn more about Shuck and Share down where you live over on the West Coast, Central Florida, etc., you could visit the Shuck and Share website and learn about all of the restaurants that are participating, projects that are using recycled shell, and how to get involved in your local county. So it's kind of a great way to encompass all of the oyster recycling programs in the state of Florida. So there are a couple of other programs in Florida that are not a part of the Shuck and Share brand, but they are still on this website because we want to create a cohesive website that allows everybody to come and view oyster recycling in Florida. So after coordinating this program for about 5 years, we've definitely been able to come up with some lessons learned, which makes it easier for our newer partners to come on board with less issues. So not everybody wants to participate. Some restaurants don't want to participate for one reason or another. Mostly it's because of the smell of the shells. Some really don't want to take the time to separate the shells from the trash, and that's okay. So we can't force anybody to participate. We're at the point now where if restaurants are coming to us, we're not going to sweat those that aren't interested. But we have had guests come in and tell us that they've opted to go to one restaurant or another, depending on whether or not they recycle shell. So we're hoping that those restaurants that don't participate will soon turn around and come and help us out. It's really hard to find a stable source of funding for this project. Currently, we are still on soft money and cross our fingers annually that our grants come through. We are very lucky that we have found a source of funding for our 2019-2020 fiscal year, but we are continually looking for that stable source of funding. What works for one county may not work for another county. Every Shuck and Share program is different. We all find what tools, materials, volunteers, and schedules work best for us and our restaurant, and just kind of do it our own way. As long as we're all creating oyster restoration materials, it's best to just go with the flow and learn to work with your partners and instead of trying to get everybody to do the same thing. And communication is key. We have some very passionate community members who are vocal about environmental issues, and by keeping them in the loop about Shuck and Share through public presentations and workshops, we're able to have ambassadors that help us spread the word and help us further our mission. And so moving forward, we really want to find that stable source of funding. Relying on grant funding is hard, but as I said, we've been very lucky to continue finding funding. However, we would like something that's a little bit more solid. It's one of my goals to continue growing the Shuck and Share program statewide, and we'd love to create these protocols into a standard program packet for new organizations to utilize, even outside of the state of Florida. We'd love to share what we know. And of course, we want to keep restoring Florida's ecosystems. I'm extremely lucky that I grew up on the coast of South Carolina and learned about the importance of oysters at a young age. So I want to be able to continue working on that passion as I grow my career. And with that, I'm happy to take a couple of questions.
Great, thanks, Jessy. So if anybody has a question that they'd like to ask out loud for Jessy, you can raise your hand and I can unmute you, or you can go ahead and type it into the question box.
And there's one more slide. I do have a question slide.
Oh, yeah. Okay, great. So I'm not seeing any raised hands yet. So, we just got a question in. Have you found a good method yet for bagging your shells?
Yes. So we have these PVC tubes that we take the bagging mesh and tie a knot at the end and put it onto the tube and kind of use it as a funnel to fill up with shell. So we shovel our shell into a 5-gallon bucket, which is what we use as a measuring stick. So each bag has 5-gallon bucket worth of shell, which weighs about 30 pounds. And then we're able to dump that into the funnel tube. And once you pull the tube out, all the shell is in the bag without you having to worry about it going down into it.
So I think Karen is going to share a few thoughts now.
Sure, yeah. So thank you all to the presenters for your presentations. I certainly learned a lot. I was taking diligent notes. I think what I got out of this is that through Josh's presentation, looking at the extraction potential of nitrogen by shellfish, when he presented his pilot projects throughout Cape Cod, is that it takes a lot of shellfish to have an impact on nitrogen, and therefore it takes a big investment. And I also took away that we don't really have an answer yet for the effectiveness of using shellfish for removing nitrogen, but we are certainly looking into that. I think there's a lot of challenges and risks associated with using shellfish for removing nitrogen. The aquaculture market is big and continues to grow, so I think that there's a lot of questions that we'll need to answer as we move forward. As Lindsay mentioned, there is an increase in demand for seafood, and the need to minimize environmental impacts has led to an increased need for sustainable aquaculture practices. I think that it was really innovative to start investigating this co-culture approach to growing kelp and oysters together at the same site. And as she mentioned, there are barriers to sustainable seaweed farming, especially during the harvesting or the post-growth phase. And then Jessy looked into what do we do with these leftover shells, especially if a lot of shellfish is required to have an impact on nitrogen. We're going to have a lot of shells left over. So what do we do with them? So she had presented an innovative approach for using the shells to restore shorelines. So that's kind of my wrap up. And then I think we were going to do a Q&A session. So turning it back over to Meredith to start going through those.
Yes, great. So we've gotten a question, which sounds like it's for Lindsay. How is kelp used as a food source, and is it subject to many of the same sources of variability as were mentioned for oysters? And is there any market for its use as a food source?
Yes, so that's a great question. I'm assuming that they are talking more domestically, but I can kind of speak to both. So globally, kelp is the #1 aquacultured seaweed in terms of how much mass of it is produced every year, and it's by and large used as a food for people. So think about miso soup, that's kelp. Seaweed salad, that's kelp. Those are sort of some of the things that we would see it in most commonly, I suppose. The company up in Maine that started seaweed farming in the US, Ocean Approved, which is now Atlantic Sea Greens, they have their own sort of line of products, which is like a flash frozen noodle substitute that's carried at Whole Foods. They make like a kimchi type product using kelp. There's some other companies making sort of vegetarian jerky products out of kelp. Or actually there's a new company in Maine also called, I can't remember the name of it right now, but Cup of Sea, and it makes teas out of different seaweeds. So those are just some examples. So by and large, it's for human food. It faces the same sort of challenges in the sense that site selection is really important. It's really important in all aquaculture, especially with shellfish and seaweeds, because you are not providing them with any food. So they have to get their nourishment from the water column. So you need to grow them in an area that's going to provide the nutrition that they need respectively. I think I might have answered all of that, but send a follow-up question if you have something that I didn't get to.
And a follow-up question from a different person, are there uses other than as a food source?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So every day of our lives, for kelp specifically? Sure. Yeah. So every day of our lives, we are using products that have seaweed in them. So things like toothpaste, the compounds that make those thick actually come from seaweed. So kelps produce a compound called alginate that is used commercially in a lot of products like non-dairy creamer, dissolvable stitches, etc. So commercial compounds are important. Also fertilizers for gardening. There are not so much pharmaceutical, there are nutraceuticals and also biomedical compounds that come out of seaweeds. Those are the big uses.
Great, thank you. We had a question for Josh that I think we'll just share with everybody. I was interested to hear that you can tell nitrogen is coming from human sources. Can you tell the percentage of human versus other sources, or just that human released nitrogen is being taken up?
Yeah, so it's a relative percent. It is not an exact percent, but based on previous research in some pretty specific water bodies here on Cape Cod, they found They really looked at those isotopic signatures of the nitrogen in the different sources, and based on those signatures applied to our oysters, you could see differences. So oysters from like open Cape Cod Bay didn't show much signature at all of human source, but those in the more enclosed salt ponds and more impacted water bodies on the south side of the Cape, they did show that signature. So it's kind of a relative measure, but in some of those water bodies, the indication was greater than 50% of the nitrogen in the shellfish's tissues was of a signature related to human sources.
Great, thanks. And we have somebody who raised their hand. So Walter, I'll go ahead and unmute you now and you can ask your question out loud.
So thanks, Karen. So I was wondering, are there advantages, or what kind of advantages are there to growing both kelp and oysters in the same farm?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in this sense, in the Northeast, they are complementary in their season. So oysters grow for multiple years in the water column. When we're farming kelp, we're only farming it over about a 6-month period from November to May, because that's what the regulations say we can do right now. So while the oysters are on the farm all winter long, the amount of work that the farmers have to put into sort of tumbling and separating oysters during the winter months is much lower, because they're hibernating and you don't really want to handle them very much. So it's sort of a period of less responsibility on the farm and an opportunity for the farmers, even though they are harvesting oysters year round, to grow an additional crop that's not really going to get in the way of them tending to their primary crop, which in this case is oysters.
Great, thanks.
You're welcome.
Great, and then another question for Josh. Are any towns recycling their oyster shells in the Cape Cod area? And if not, do the shells get landfilled?
There's some small pilot scale efforts to recycle their shells. We don't have the traditional reef type habitat that we're looking to restore here, but there are some efforts to sort of play around with living shorelines. But by and large, most of it is not recycled at this point. So, I don't know exactly what restaurants do with their waste, but I would assume it probably ends up in the landfill if it's not recycled.
Okay, great, thank you. A question for Jessy. Have any studies been carried out to measure the success of the shoreline restoration projects using shells?
Yes. So University of Central Florida is one of our partners that is utilizing our recycled shell, and they are monitoring their shorelines and oyster reefs quarterly. So I don't have any of that data offhand, mostly because it's still being looked at and going to be published. But we are seeing success with living shorelines, helping with accreting sediment, and with this recycled oyster shell being used as a base layer for new oyster habitats on reefs.
Great, thank you. And then a question for Lindsay. Is anyone trying to assess the water quality improvements associated with kelp growth as they are with shellfish growth?
Yes, so the numbers, I didn't actually talk in detail about them, but on my slide, I listed some numbers for how many kilograms of nitrogen, phosphorus, and carbon dioxide are extracted by kelp. So that was work done in Long Island Sound by Charlie Yarish and his research group at the University of Connecticut. And also as part of the project that we are conducting right now, we are analyzing carbon and nitrogen content of the kelp, and so we can extrapolate from that how much they're removing from the water column. We also conducted some experiments which we're still looking at the data, but we quantified how fast they were taking up carbon and nitrogen on the various farms. So those are a couple of ways that we're trying to get at that question, and those results will hopefully be coming out in the coming months.
Great, thank you. Another question for you from Peter. He's asking, does kelp farming do better in protected sites versus open ocean sites where wave energy can be high?
That's a great question. So it's going to depend to some extent on the species of kelp. So there are some species of kelp that you only find in very exposed high wave energy environments versus sugar kelp, which is commonly farmed. It can actually change its morphology depending on whether it's in sheltered or exposed environments. And so it does that as a way to increase nutrient uptake if it's in a place that doesn't have a lot of water flow. So you can kind of harness that flexibility in, the organism and farm it over a variety of different locations versus some kelps like Laminaria digitata, which we call the horsetail kelp, that likes a lot of wave energy. Some people are farming that in the Gulf of Maine, but it's more restricted in its sort of demographics where you can farm it.
And are some of the morphologies more desirable for food than others?
Some of the morphologies are more desirable for farming because they yield a higher weight per meter. So for example, it's actually a different species we've decided now, but there's a kelp that it's called affectionately the skinny kelp. It looks sort of like a belt. It's very long and thin. And you can get almost twice as much kilograms of that kelp per meter of longline than sugar kelp. However, that kelp is not native to southern New England. It is only found in Maine. So we don't farm it here.
Oh, very interesting. Another question for you. Juliet is wondering, where does the alginate used in commercial products in the U.S. currently come from, and are there opportunities for U.S. kelp growers to get into that market?
That is a great question. I don't fully, so the alginate is coming primarily from the big producers. So for kelp, the big producers are going to be China and Japan, and probably some in Korea. So kelp is a cold water crop. So there's a lot of seaweed production in the tropics, but you can't grow kelp in the tropics. So those are sort of the big three in terms of how much kelp they're producing. So it's most certainly coming from there. Could we get into it? I think the issue with competing in sort of the alginate or phycocolloids, as we call them, in that market is labor cost and profitability. So you're going to get, I think it's a really low value sort of thing. And so with the capital costs and the labor costs in the United States, I think the farming community is going to have to go for more value added products to make it a profitable market. But I'm not an economist, so that's my sort of non-expert take on the economic side of things.
All right, great. Well, thank you everybody for attending this webinar. Thank you again to the speakers. I just wanted to mention that this is the first webinar in a series of webinars that SNEP is hosting. Our next webinar will be about innovations in stormwater management, and that will be on October 1st. So everybody who signed up to attend this webinar will be added to the mailing list for information about that webinar. And then lastly, I just wanted to mention that since this is the first in the series, we would appreciate any feedback that you have about today's webinar. And so once the webinar closes in your browser, there will be a short evaluation for you all to fill out. And like I said, we would be very appreciative of that.